Chapter 8. The Werewolves. The End of the Third Reich and the Birth of the Werewolves. By 1943, even the most ardent Nazi supporter could see the end was near. In February, the German Sixth Army, long-suffering in the frozen hell of Stalingrad, finally collapsed under the massive weight of the Red Army. Only 4 months later, in the scorching sands of Tunisia, the German Afrika Korps and its Italian allies were crushed by a combined British and American force. And then, that July, any glimmer of hope went up in smoke at the Battle of Kursk, along with the shot-up hulls of 100 burning panzers. While the conventional war was most certainly lost, some leaders in the German war machine looked for other means to continue German resistance. Thus did impending defeat give birth to a fledgling Nazi guerrilla movement. The resistance movement was called Werewolf, after the book by Harman Lanz entitled Der Werewolf. Lanz's novel spun a tale of German communities waging a guerrilla war against invading armies during the 30 Years' War, a conflict that devastated German society. Also, a werewolf is a mythical creature that is human by day, but turns into fearsome, bloodthirsty creature at night. What better code name for the German resistance than one drawing on a historic guerrilla movement and a terrifying myth that inspired fear at the same time? While the idea to create a guerrilla movement was born in 1943, the werewolf movement was not officially organized until the fall of 1944 under the leadership of Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler's High SS and Police Leaders, HSSPF. Himmler picked SS Lieutenant General Hans Preutzmann as his personal representative to oversee the werewolf program. While the handsome Preutzmann, with a severe dueling scar on his face, was an exceedingly competent officer, he also accumulated enemies within the Third Reich bureaucracy because of his arrogance. Regardless of his abrasive personality, as a leader in the HSSPF, Preutzmann certainly possessed the resume for the job since he spent several years on the Eastern Front conducting counterinsurgency operations in the Ukraine. With his background, Preutzmann was well versed in the discipline of guerrilla warfare, such as methods of infiltration, the interrogation and exploitation of prisoners, the use of propaganda, and the pacification of populated areas with techniques ranging from police checkpoints and curfews to mass executions and scorched earth policies. However, from the very beginning, Preutzmann's werewolf organization suffered from a lack of bureaucratic support and was forced to draw recruits and supplies from several different sources. True, Preutzmann could get weapons, equipment, and recruits from the Waffen-SS, the Field SS, the RHSA, Reich Security Central Office, the Gestapo, and the Hitler Youth as ordered by Himmler. But as the situation became increasingly more desperate for the collapsing Reich, these organizations were less willing to part with their limited resources to help a rival group. Also, support from Germany's armed forces outside of SS channels, like the Wehrmacht, felt no obligation to help the werewolf program. Some army commanders saw the usefulness of the werewolf movement and helped accordingly, while others did not. The werewolf program, by being placed under the SS and specifically the HSSPF, ensured it was never fully supported by the key personalities of Germany's various bureaucratic fiefdoms. This situation forced Perry Biddiscombe, the leading expert on the werewolf, to surmise, "It is thus impossible not to conclude that the werewolf was poorly organized, that it suffered from a terminal case of bureaucratization, and that most of the limited success in German guerrilla warfare were gained despite the organization rather than because of it." In the end, the werewolf program was only able to recruit an estimated 6,000 men and women. The paltry number was like sticking a single feeble finger in a massive dike and would burst forth with the combined fury of the Soviet and Western armies. Werewolf training. The werewolf recruits, who were culled largely from the ranks of the Hitler Youth, received training in a variety of skills like basic weapons familiarization, sabotage, and the use of demolitions, orienteering, field survival, camouflage, basic infantry tactics, and wireless radio operations. Not every werewolf received the same training, since instruction varied from region to region depending on the time and resources available. Some courses were several weeks long and others only a few days. Overall, the quality and duration of the instruction was not even close to what was required to accomplish such a monumental task. It was clear the Germans only had a rudimentary understanding of guerrilla warfare, even though they repressed various resistance movements across the breadth of Europe for several years. Fighting a guerrilla movement was one thing, but actually building a successful underground organization was far harder than they anticipated. An indication of the Germans' lack of preparation for unconventional warfare was the fact the first guerrilla warfare manuals the werewolf students were issued were captured from the Russian and then translated into German. It was only at the start of 1945 when an original guerrilla warfare manual was drafted and issued specifically for the werewolf movement. This manual, while at least written by the Germans themselves, was rudimentary at best and revealed nothing new, innovative, or particularly effective for waging a guerrilla war. The manual would have been better marketed as an outdoor survival guide. As this manual indicates, the Germans saw the werewolf as a rural movement living in the countryside, away from the cities, and only having minimal contact with the population when it was necessary. Essentially, the Germans copied what the Russian partisan movement did in their own guerrilla campaign against them on the Eastern Front. The werewolf movement was thus only prepared to conduct operations in a rural, not an urban, environment. This created severe problems for the werewolf organization as a whole. While the werewolves received rudimentary training in fieldcraft and traditional small unit combat operations, this was the exact area their enemies excelled in. The Russian, British, French, and American forces who occupied Germany in 1945 were well prepared for such kinds of rural counter-guerrilla operations. In fact, they preferred to fight such a war in the woods and hinterland away from the real sources of power such as major population, economic, and industrial centers. By focusing on a rural existence, the werewolves isolated themselves from the people and their own potential sources of support. They incorrectly judged the physical terrain, like inaccessible mountains and forests, was more important than the human terrain for their success. As the surging Allied forces relentlessly ground forward into Germany and then occupied the fatherland outright, the werewolves found themselves drawn to the cities like a magnet. They could not help it. Enemy collaborators and traitors who no longer supported the defunct Nazi government and thus were targeted for assassination or intimidation by the werewolves lived in the cities. Occupation forces had their barracks, supply depots, headquarters, radio stations, chow halls, hospitals, and checkpoints established in the major urban areas. The battle for the hearts and minds of the conquered German people took place in built-up areas like Munich, Bremen, and Hamburg. The capital of Berlin alone had a pre-war population of 4 million people. Consequently, when the werewolf guerrillas found themselves forced to conduct their operations in the urban areas, they were unprepared and outmatched. The werewolves conducted the full spectrum of operations in their guerrilla war against the occupation forces. Explosives were placed on parked military vehicles, blowing them up in place. Gas tanks were filled with sugar. Telephone lines were cut. Wires were affixed to trees at head height to decapitate soldiers riding on motorcycles or in open-top jeeps. Tanks lined up in motor pools were shot up with anti-armor weapons like the portable Panzerfaust. Concealed landmines were hidden on dirt roads used by enemy forces. While the Germans certainly had the technology and equipment to electronically detonate explosives and landmines, what today we would call an improvised explosive device, IED, the werewolves were untrained in this art in an urban setting. Small units of werewolves also ambushed vulnerable Allied patrols when possible. The guerrillas could draw on supplies from the excellent Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck anti-tank weapons to blow up careless supply convoys or military police vehicles. The tried and tested MG-34 and MG-42 general-purpose machine guns were also perfect for ambushing. Allied foot patrols or unarmored vehicles like motorcycles, jeeps, and trucks. However, there were large weapons, not easily concealed, and difficult to employ clandestinely in a populated area. Acts of sabotage and intimidation were better suited to the werewolves because it was less risky and required less training, something the guerrillas sorely lacked. It was much safer to derail supply trains, booby-trap industrial buildings, set fire to fuel dumps, and distribute anti-occupation literature. In one storied example, a werewolf hit team was sent to the western German town of Aachen and assassinated the mayor, an attorney by the name of Franz Oppenhoff. In another heralded incident, 2 members of Field Marshal Montgomery's personal staff were ambushed by the Hitler Youth in April 1945. Major Peter Earle was wounded and Major John Poston was killed. Despite these few successes, exhausting research by the leading expert on the United States post-war occupation of Europe, Earl Zimke, shows the werewolf movement produced few concrete results. Ziemke found, except for black marketing, some thefts of food and firewood, and petty violations of military government ordinances, the German civilian crime rate was low, sometimes almost disconcertingly low, for the army agencies charged with ferreting out and suppressing resistance. Patrols occasionally found decapitation wires stretched across roads, ineptly, it would seem, since no deaths or injuries resulted from them. Military, government, public safety officers from scattered locations reported various anti-occupation leaflets and posters. Some threats against German girls who associated with U.S. soldiers and isolated attacks on soldiers. Aside from the murder of Oppenhoff and the ambush of Montgomery's staff, the werewolf movement was unable to change the tide of the losing war or construct an underground movement with any sort of longevity. Guerrilla sniping potential. When it came to sniping, the werewolf movement certainly had the potential for a deadly campaign. For one, there was an abundance of anonymous weapons available for sniping use. The most likely candidate was the reliable, accurate Mauser carbiner 98 battle rifle, chambered for the 7.92mm round produced by the millions and used by conventional German snipers in every theater of the war. Most German soldiers were at least familiar with the K-98, and many civilians received basic marksmanship training on it to include the Volkssturm, Home Defense Militia Forces, the Hitler Youth, and even the League of German Women. While the K-98 could be paired with factory-made sound suppressors, the suppressors were little understood and rarely used, the K-98 was still a large, conventional rifle that was hard to conceal. The resistance also had access to the Gewehr 4143, a 7.92mm semi-automatic battle rifle, which was produced in much smaller quantities than the K-98, but was still used by the Reich snipers. Some sound suppressors were manufactured and tested on the Gewehr 43, but there's no evidence they were ever fielded for combat. Perhaps better suited for urban sniping was the FG-42, a compact, 36 inches in length, semi-automatic rifle fed by a 20-round box magazine. The FG-42 was designed for Germans' Fallschirmjägers, paratroopers, could be fitted with a scope, and with its large-capacity magazine was ideal for rapidly engaging multiple targets in an urban setting. Also, since it fired single shot from a closed bolt, it was fairly accurate. A late addition to the sniping arsenal was the Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle, which was shorter in length than the K-98 and the Gewehr 4143, could be fitted with a scope, and was fed by a 30-round box magazine. A sister assault rifle was the semi-automatic Volkssturmgewehr 1-5, which was designed as part of a primitive weapons program and produced for the civilian Volkssturm. This weapon was not very accurate, was designed to be produced cheaply en masse, and was first produced in January 1945. Enterprising shooters could even use pistols for sniping, like the semi-automatic Mauser C96 broom handle, which fired a 9mm round and came with a detachable shoulder stock that doubled as a holster. The Mauser C96 had the advantage of being concealable and exhibited the stable characteristics of a carbine when fitted with the stock. In one incident, Hitler Youth Werewolf was captured with a Mauser pistol with several notches cut into the handle, presumably for the number of kills made. All of these weapons suffered from the fact that they were conventional weapons intended for use in overt warfare. None of them had collapsible stocks, so they could not be concealed on one's person or hidden in an easily accessible cache, except for pistols. These weapons were never intended to be used with a sound suppressor, and, except for the K-98, factory-made suppressors were not available. Why suppressors were produced for the K-98, there's no evidence German snipers, conventional or otherwise, were instructed and skilled in their use. The Germans did use suppressed weapons on rare occasion during special operations. The werewolf hit team that assassinated the mayor of Aachen used a suppressed pistol, but there is no evidence werewolf snipers were ever taught the necessary art of suppressed sniping. The werewolf sniping campaign. There is very little recorded about the werewolves' actual sniper campaign, and there is no published personal accounts from werewolf snipers. However, from studying post-war records, we know sniping was a widespread tactic, both while the German armed forces were retreating back into the Reich and when the fatherland was occupied by the Allied armies. For example, in late August 1944, as the Allied forces and the French resistance liberated the capital of Paris, hidden German snipers opened fire on the celebrating Parisians, sending people scattering in all directions. This was a fitting end to the occupation of the city, since French guerrilla snipers recently helped kick out most of the German garrison by picking off careless Wehrmacht troopers. The guerrilla sniping continued as the Americans moved east and captured the quaint town of Sarreguemines on the German border in December 1944. Even though Sarreguemines was under American control for several weeks, SS guerrilla snipers continued to target soldiers of the 35th Division who occupied the town. As the Allied armies continued to pound the collapsing Reich and enter German soil proper, more guerrilla snipers were encountered. In March 1945, guerrilla riflemen targeted surging American forces when they entered the western German town of Bad Kreuznach, which before the war was known for producing quality Riesling wines. In April 1945, the American 42nd Infantry Division entered the city of Würzburg, located in central Bavaria. Würzburg was considerably larger than Sarreguemines in population and had a much bigger urban area with taller buildings. This meant Würzburg was better suited for urban sniping, and the invading American forces found themselves plagued by guerrilla marksmen, even though the city was officially secured and no uniformed German soldiers were present. That same month, American troops rolled into Nuremberg, the site of the Third Reich's famous Nazi Party rallies. Here, the invading forces encountered teenage guerrilla snipers as young as 14 who hid in spider holes, allowing the American forces to advance past them. Once the Americans cleared an area, the guerrilla snipers dressed in civilian clothes would appear from their hide sites and open fire. Because of these stay-behind tactics and the more densely populated urban terrain of Nuremberg, U.S. soldiers spent considerable time searching again and again areas of the city which, by all accounts, had been secured. On the Eastern Front, the Russians too encountered German guerrilla snipers who placed them in their crosshairs. The Eastern guerrillas used the same stay-behind tactics as their Western brothers, with the goal of shooting the advancing Russians in the back or to kill unsuspecting rear echelon troops who thought they were in the safety of pacified areas. Marshal Zhukov, famed general of the Russian 62nd Army at Stalingrad, noted the German guerrillas. They hid in the basements and in ruins, and they allowed the forward units of our advancing forces to pass, and sometimes the rearward units as well, and then opened fire, with the object of sowing panic in the rear and slowing down or paralyzing action along the front line. In another incident, werewolf snipers targeted Red Army support troops in the town of Steglitz, a suburb of Berlin. The Russians suspected the fire came from a nearby apartment complex and diverted troops to clear out the building. On May 5, 1945, a week after Germany officially surrendered, 3 Red Army soldiers were shot and found dead on the grounds of the beautiful botanical gardens located in the southwestern Berlin. Just 2 days later, a Soviet officer was shot from the ruins along the Berlinstrasse. Then, in late July, 2 Soviet railway guards were shot at night. 1 soldier was wounded and the other killed. Werewolf snipers even managed to stay underground long enough to target Soviet occupation forces into the new year, as a Red Army Guard unit in Merseburg found on January 1, 1946, when hidden snipers opened fire, wounding a man. The problem with werewolf snipers. While the werewolf guerrilla snipers experienced minor success, sowing fear behind the front lines by picking off scores of careless soldiers, their overall effect was limited. In most cases, werewolf snipers made some close shots or scored a few kills and then were taken out. For example, the American 42nd Infantry Division in Würzburg suffered from guerrilla sniping, but during a search of the town, they found and captured 5 civilian snipers, both men and women, who were hiding in a cellar. Obviously, this group pursued the standard stay-behind sniper cell tactic, which could only result in a short-term success. The cell did not have a credible long-term cover story for being in the area. They could not find a practical safe house to hide in, and thus were unable to blend into the civilian population, which is an absolute necessity for any guerrilla movement. In other cases, werewolf snipers displayed poor snipercraft, firing from easily identified positions. In the medieval German town of Tangermund, underage werewolf snipers opened fire on the oncoming American soldiers who were in turn able to identify the source of incoming fire. Thus, it was a relatively easy task to call in supporting artillery units to destroy the buildings the snipers were hiding in. These inexperienced shooters never stood a chance. Other werewolf snipers would simply lay on the ground as if dead, allow their enemy to pass them by, and then open fire. While this kind of tactic might allow for a single successful shot, the shooter was sure to be captured or killed soon after. In short, these tactics offered no prospect for long-term success. Part of the reason for the werewolf sniping failure were the snipers themselves. Notably, the Germans were the first nation to use large numbers of underage boys in an organized manner to conduct guerrilla sniping. While these young boys, most of them products of the Hitler Youth indoctrination program, were easily manipulated and at times fearless, they also suffered from poor tactical judgment and the ability to comprehend the complexities and nuances of modern urban guerrilla sniping. These preteen shooters, some of whom were as young as 8, certainly did not have the mental maturity to understand counterforensics, interrogation, counterinterrogation methodology, or even the basic physiques of concealing a gunshot. The best these boys could do was don civilian clothes, drag their heavy rifle to a window, fire a shot, and then wait to get captured or blown away. Hardly a prescription for a successful guerrilla sniping campaign. It would be easy to blame the sniping failure on impressionable prepubescent boys who were brainwashed into fighting Hitler's disastrous world war, but this is just part of the answer. The historical record shows adult werewolf snipers, both men and women, also failed in their efforts to conduct an effective guerrilla sniper campaign. This lack of effective snipercraft can be attributed directly to their poor training in the art of both sniping and guerrilla warfare. For instance, the werewolves' issued guerrilla training manual spent much of its space on how to block mountain roads, how to camouflage oneself, and how to construct survival shelters. This is what the manual said about guerrilla sniping. It is very advantageous to use a silenced weapon and to have a sniper weapon. Also, some of the weapons should be equipped with luminous sights. And there you have it. The manual spends more time on showing how to navigate wooded terrain with the help of a pocket watch than it does teaching the art of sniping. We do know some werewolf units received dedicated sniper instruction from various units like the SS and Wehrmacht, but the quality of this training varied in both length and quality depending on the local wartime circumstances. Judging from the ultimate results on the battlefield, this training was unsatisfactory at best. We know German sniper schools used pre-war Russian sniper films to train their own marksmen because they did not value the art of sniping enough to make their own films until the war was already lost. We also know German-made sniper training films, when they were finally produced, concentrated on rural tactics. The only urban snipercraft these films taught was for the shooter to fire from a building with multiple open windows. That was it. Combine these substandard sniper training efforts with the Germans' belated guerrilla warfare program, which was again based on the Russians' own manuals, and you have an undertrained guerrilla sniper corps completely unprepared for the rigors of sniping in an urban guerrilla warfare environment. Allied counterinsurgency operations. Guerrilla sniper cells do not function in a vacuum. They are just one part of a larger resistance movement. As soon as the werewolf snipers began pulling their triggers, it became obvious they were working for an organization enjoying little popular support. Part of this antipathy came from the fact the majority of Germans did not support the Nazi Party. The most Hitler ever won in open elections was 36% of the votes cast in 1932, and they certainly did not support a resistance movement seeking to bring back rule of the party. After all, who wanted to reinstate the concentration camps, Gestapo torture, and slave labor? Perhaps, of even more importance, the German people were physically and psychologically exhausted from more than 6 years of constant warfare. The Germans lost well over 5.5 million uniformed men and women and 1.5 million civilians during the course of the war, 10% of their pre-war population. Many of their cities, like Dresden, Cologne, and Berlin, were bombed into rubble or destroyed during devastating street fighting. Most Germans wanted a normal life free of never-ending, morale-sapping warfare. All the werewolf movement promised was more of the same. Hence, the werewolf movement was susceptible to the Allied forces' counterinsurgency measures. One thing the occupation forces promised were harsh reprisals and mass punishment for supporting the resistance. The Russians, in particular, had little tolerance for guerrilla snipers wearing civilian clothes and shooting their soldiers in the back after hostilities ended. The Russians lost an estimated 20 million casualties during the war and were not in a charitable mood. Stalin promised to unleash his secret police, the NKVD, on any population supporting the guerrillas, and this meant the mass rape of German women, the imprisonment of large numbers of people in deadly slave labor camps, and the summary execution of captured guerrillas. The German population was so fearful of the Red Menace, an American war correspondent reporting from Berlin in the spring of 1945 noted snipers were operating behind the Russian lines and the people lived in absolute terror because the least suspicion of sniping meant death. While the American occupation forces in the West practiced a more humane form of counterinsurgency, the consequences of supporting the guerrillas were still unpleasant. Nobody wanted to adhere to nightly curfews or have to show their identification cards at menacing checkpoints or have their homes searched in the middle of the night. Also, the Americans executed werewolves who were captured wearing civilian clothes. Plus, the U.S. government actually seemed interested in rebuilding Germany, and the American soldiers proved to be exceedingly friendly with the German people. Consequently, when a werewolf sniper cell opened fire on American soldiers in Bad Kreuznach in March 1945, it did not take long to penetrate the resistance and find the culprits. Only several weeks after the shooting, the werewolf cell was penetrated and 17 suspected guerrillas arrested. The American Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, found many captured werewolf members turned quickly against their fellow insurgents, which made it easier to penetrate the German resistance. In another case, British occupation forces captured 2 werewolves who quickly rolled over on the rest of their cell despite little pressure to do so. The attitude was typical at first, openly defiant, then as hunger and fatigue began to work, more and more malleable. The amusing thing about these youths, and the Nazis we subsequently questioned, was their complete willingness to betray one another once they were convinced a friend tattled, and it required very little persuasion to convince them that they had been betrayed. To the disappointment of some of our men, it was quite unnecessary to become physical in the interrogation. As a result, we organized a raiding party of 4 officers and 6 enlisted men. We picked up 3 Nazis in possession of illegal arms. All of them lied like troopers to start with, but invariably would lead us to where the weapons were hidden, generally under the eaves of an outbuilding. In fact, it was so easy to penetrate the werewolf movement, one joint British-American counterinsurgency operation in December 1945 managed to round up and jail 2,500 suspected insurgents. The Allied forces were so successful in rooting out the resistance, using informers and double agents, they estimated by January 1946 the werewolf movement was crushed with no hope of recovering. In total, the Americans and British detained 80,000 suspected resistance members, while the Russians imprisoned almost 250,000 people, of which 1/3 died in captivity. Another important element of why the Allied forces were so successful in their relatively harsh counter-sniper, counterinsurgency efforts was Germany's isolation on the world stage. No country in Europe was going to intervene on Germany's behalf to protest the rough treatment of the German people, who had any sympathy for the creators of the Holocaust. Importantly, the German resistance movement did not have a single bordering foreign sanctuary to operate from. Germany was surrounded by its former victims and current enemies like France, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, to name just a few, who wanted revenge and certainly supported the stern counter-guerrilla operations of the victors. Hence, the Allied forces got away with using indiscriminate firepower to silence werewolf gunmen like that. The American army fought its way into Offenburg, Germany, and called in fighter bombers to blow up buildings housing guerrilla snipers. The German werewolf, a failed movement. The werewolf sniper program was a reflection of the overall German understanding of guerrilla warfare, which was limited at best. While the German people were able to create the greatest conventional military war machine known to man up till that time, they spent little effort improving the art of sniping and certainly spent no time perfecting its use by guerrillas. To be fair, the Germans achieved the same level of guerrilla sniping expertise as their peers, which is not saying much. At that point in history, few countries put much thought into how to wage a successful guerrilla campaign, and the idea of waging a successful urban guerrilla campaign was an even more alien concept. The art of urban guerrilla sniping suffered accordingly, falling under the shadow of general apathy. Even urban guerrilla movements that fought during the war, like the Polish Home Army and the French Resistance, displayed little innovation in the field of guerrilla sniping. From the perspective of the student of urban guerrilla sniping, the werewolf movement is good to use as a baseline. The werewolves displayed the same level of urban sniping competence that would be reasonably expected from any other resistance movement of that period. During World War II, the art of urban guerrilla sniping was still in its infancy. It would be several more decades before urban guerrilla snipers learned to shoot from vehicles, to use sound suppressors, to construct remote sniping systems, to practice strict counter-forensic measures, to use human bait, and to film and market their sniping exploits to a global audience. The art of urban guerrilla sniping would become progressively more deadly and effective, but it would take several more wars to evolve.